Welcome to Older Militarist Radio TV, and we're lifelong Catholics, and we'll do this all for free. In for our love of Jesus Christ, in for our Holy Mother, the Church, and we'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Now we begin to get into the life of Douglas MacArthur. We're just going to skim through a little bit of his childhood, and it's pretty interesting. And we're with Brother Alexis Bonello.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV to cover the life of this great American general. And I want to thank the Douglas A. MacArthur Library in Norfolk, Virginia, for giving us permission to excerpt from this book. And AJ, you might want to show everyone the book, so if they would like to get a copy. And this is a book written by MacArthur, so you can't get more authoritative than this. So we covered his heroic and very capable father who had no college education and yet was one of the best generals of his age, military leaders of his age, in the U.S. Armed Forces.
Yep.
Now we're going to cover the son, that native ability there. So where was Douglas born? We'll start with his birth.
So he was born January 26, 1880 at Little Rock Barracks in Arkansas.
Okay, so I assume that's at the capital, today's state capital, Little Rock. And, that surprised me. I didn't know he was born in Arkansas. I thought he was born in the East or somewhere in Virginia. His mother's from Norfolk. And what do we know about his childhood that is going on to be almost like an epic, famous quote of MacArthur?
Yeah, so the family lived on succession of army posts in the American Old West. Conditions were primitive, and Malcolm died of the measles in 1883. In his memoirs, Reminiscence, MacArthur wrote, "I learned to ride and shoot even before I could read or write. Indeed, almost before I could walk and talk."
So he came from a violent gun-owning family, as the left would say. They
Yeah.
never want you to own guns, so because Antifa floods the streets armed, they don't want anyone shooting at them, like that famous youngster, Rittenhouse. So, it's common sense to know how to defend yourself, and in your military, you're taught to use arms for just causes, and that's we totally agree with that. And so I would expect, and he was growing up since his father turned out to be one of the highest ranking officers in the U.S. Army, that he went to West Point.
Yeah, so he went to on June 13th, 1899, and he says, "I enrolled at the United States Military Academy. Life at West Point is rigid discipline in an atmosphere of culture and learning, but all is not drudgery in this world apart from all the other worlds. There was thrill of high competition on the athletic field, dances and excitement, and happy hours with beautiful ladies. I worked
Yes.
hard and I played hard."
So, growing up at military bases, military posts out in the Old West, you wouldn't really see much of social life. West Point would have seemed like totally immersed society. Lee said it was a den of iniquity. MacArthur had a better view of it. So, did you say he enrolled on the 13th of June? I thought their school year began in the fall. Do we know anything about that?
Yeah. If you're going to enroll, you're going to enroll like any normal college. But if if you have someone that's going to promote you and get you one of those special things where the president or the governor appoints you, then you'll start in the fall probably.
Okay. So, how did what did MacArthur? Is there something other that MacArthur says of his years there, and how did he finish his? How did he finish in his graduating class? I think it's a 4-year term, right?
Yeah. So this one part almost ruins it. In that awful moment when a tactical officer caught me on a flirtation while publicly kissing a girl, and instead of reporting me for unbecoming conduct, just grinned and said, "Congratulations, Mr. MacArthur." Then he goes on. In that day in the classroom, the first section was studying the space-time relationship, later formulated by Einstein as his theory of relativity. The text was complex, and being unable to comprehend it, I committed the pages to memory. When I was called upon to recite, I solemnly reeled off almost word for word what the book said. Our instructor, Colonel Philberger, looked at me somewhat quizzically and asked, "Do you understand this theory?" It was a bad moment for me, but I did not hesitate in replying, "No, sir." You could have heard a pin drop. I braced myself and waited, and then the slow words of the professor, "Neither do I, Mr. MacArthur. Section dismissed." And he says, "I still do not understand the theory."
Okay, so he had an amazing memory. To memorize an entire page is something that most young people can't do today, but that was one of the educational methods in the 19th century, to have to memorize long poems um, uh, uh, that went on for dozens of pages. And so that's quite amazing. It shows that what quality his reminiscences are. If he has a memory like that, then this book about his life is going to have a lot of details in it, because his memory was so clear. And to be a great commander, you need a good memory, because you not only have to know everything that's going on, you have to remember everything that went on very well to know how you're going to organize your campaigns. How did he
So,
graduate in his class? Oh, do you want to read some more? Or how did he graduate?
yeah, I won my A, became first captain of the Corps, and to my amazement, record the highest scholastic record in 25 years. This rating has always astonished me, and I have never understood it. There were a number of my classmates who were smarter than I, and I am sure there were even a greater number in the preceding 24 classes. I studied no longer, no harder than others, and can only account for such a result by my having, perhaps, a somewhat clearer perspective of events, a better realization that first things came first. Then finally, I graduated on June 11, 1903, as the second lieutenant of engineers, with the words of Secretary of War Elu Root ringing in my ears. "Before you leave the Army, according to all precedents in our history, you'll be engaged in another war. It is bound to come and will come. Prepare your country for that war."
Okay, so his good academic record, probably based on his memory, that's one of the most important skills when you're going to take an exam. And so, but a humble man. When you're writing your reminiscences and you have to talk about that you were top of the class, I don't think you would say something that humble. I don't think you have students that would boast today about that.
Yeah.
So an engineer, I'm kind of surprised. I thought MacArthur would have been that's assigned to some combat unit or some strategic planning unit. He joined the Army Engineers, which is basically building fortifications. And what kind of fortifications the U.S. needs has never been invaded. But 1903, what is his first post?
So he says, "To my great delight, my first assignment was in the Philippines Islands. My father now commanded on the Pacific coast with headquarters in San Francisco. I spent my graduation furlough there. It was a pleasant summer, indeed, in a city whose charm extends to all we have enjoyed its hospitality." Then he goes on, when I was last there and saw that massive metropolis with its limitless growth and potential, I could not but marvel. They named the fort which was built to protect the harbor in my father's honor, Fort MacArthur.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing. San Francisco is not yet the den of iniquity, or I should say the gutter of iniquity it is today. And as we covered in the father's life, the father was posted in the Philippines and in Japan. And when I see MacArthur's career follows this, he was not for nothing assigned to be a commander in the Pacific Theater. He had known it from his childhood.
Yeah.
And
So,
this is probably the chief reason he's chosen the military governor of Japan. Okay, so what does he do in the Philippines, AJ?
so he says, I arrived in Manila after a 38-day voyage aboard the transport ship Sherman. The Philippines charmed me, the delightful hospitality, the respect and affection expressed for my father, the amazingly attractive result of a mixture of Spanish culture and American industry, the languorous lays that seem to glamorize even the most routine chores of life, the fun-loving men, the moonbeam delicacy of its lovely women, fastened me with a grip that has never relaxed. During my tour of a year, I engaged in typical engineering duties in many parts of the islands. I worked on surveys at Tacloban Harbor, harbor improvements in Manila Bay, fortifications installations off Corregidor, traverse, traverses over the steaming wooded hills of Bataan. Then they were attempting to construct piers and docks at Guimaras Island, located at the mouth of Bodo Harbor. Had to procure my own pilings, and it took a small detachment to cut timber in the jungle forest. The place was dangerous, being infested with brigands and guerrillas. In spite of my early frontier training, I became careless and allowed myself to be waylaid on a narrow jungle trail by two of these desperados, one on each side. Like all frontiersmen, I was expert with the pistol. I dropped them both dead in their tracks, but not before one had blazed away at me with his antiquated rifle. The slugs tore through the top of my campaign hat and almost cut the sapling tree immediately behind me. My foreman, a regular army sergeant and veteran of long years of service, came rushing up. He looked long and hard at the two dead men sprawled on the trail, at my crownless hat still smoking from the blast, at the broken tree behind me, and then rolling his quid of tobacco into a hollow of his cheek. He slowly drew himself up to his full 6 feet of height, his heels clicking together, and saluted and drawled in his rich Irish brogue, begging the lieutenant's pardon, but all the rest of the lieutenant's life is pure velvet.
So here we see that MacArthur, like his father, had a providential protection from bullets that could have ended his life and his career and all the contributions he made to the in the campaign against Japan and in the defense of South Korea. So that's quite amazing. And boy, he must have been a pretty good sharp shooter. Six, on the draw there. We don't know what kind of. Does he mention what kind of pistol he used?
Um,
You have any guess, AJ? I know you're an expert in guns.
1903, probably been a revolver still.
Mhm. Okay, so how many years is he in Manila?
Just one, then he moves on in early October and was suddenly ordered to join his father in Japan, where he had been sent to observe the Russo-Japanese War.
Okay, and probably to get him out from being killed by desperados. He won that battle, but I'm sure his father was quite concerned. So the Russo-Japanese War, for those who don't know, was the folly of the Russian emperor to go to war with Japan, who had a modern navy when Russia did not. And the entire Russian navy in the Pacific was sunk in like 15 minutes. except the Russians did succeed using a torpedo sinking a Japanese destroyer. But it was a horrendous defeat for Russia. And it was of great interest to all the world powers because they wanted to see what a modern navy could do in battle, since there hadn't been any wars with modern naval ships. And Japan had quickly modernized and built a whole bunch of dreadnoughts and such not. So we already covered how his father wanted to be able to get posted to Manchuria to watch that war close up, and only got there really late and didn't see much. But
Yeah. So the purpose of our observation was to measure the strength of the Japanese army and its methods of warfare. In Washington, there was a growing uneasiness. In January 1905, President Roosevelt wrote, "If Japan is careful and is guided by the best minds in her empire, she can become one of the leaders of the family of great nations. But if she is narrow, insular, if she tries to gain from her victory in the Russo-Japanese War more than she ought to have, she will array against her all the great powers, and however determined she may be, she cannot successfully face an allied world." And 2 months later, he addressed the chairman of the House Committee on Military Affairs, Representative J.A.T. Hull, as follows: It may be that the Japanese have designs on the Philippines. I hope not. I am inclined to believe not, but I believe we should put our naval and military preparation in such shape that we can hold the Philippines against any foe. Then MacArthur meets the Japanese commanders, Oyama, Kuroki, Nogi, and the brilliant Admiral Ether Hachiro Togo. Those
Mhm. Mhm.
those grim, taciturn, aloof men of iron character and unshakable purpose. It was here that I first encountered the boldness and courage of the Nipponese soldier. His almost fanatical belief and reverence for his emperor impressed me indelibly.
Okay, so you can see he was getting a lot of first-hand information that he would be using in the future. And people often wonder why the U.S. has military advisors around the world, because they're gathering intelligence, they're gathering information about all the armed forces of the world. And when the U.S. sends you a military advisor, that's not entirely a friendly affair. So um, he uses the word Nipponese. Maybe people in modern times don't know that, but Nippon in Japanese language is the name for Japan. They don't call Japan Japan, they call it Nippon. And so Nipponese means Japanese. It's not derogatory or anything.
Then he meets the army general Yukasata Okyo, and he writes, he was afflicted by the dread disease of beriberi. What's beriberi?
I believe it's an infection of a parasitical infection of the stomach.
Mm. The surgeon prescribed a prophylactic and put up in a small tin can with the inscription, "To prevent beriberi, take one pill there 3 times a day." Soldiers are much the same throughout the world. They took the pill once, spat it out, and then dumped the can into the mud. The surgeon was at his wits' end until the bright young officer suggested that the can be marked, "To prevent beriberi, the Emperor desires you to take one pill 3 times a day." The result was instantaneous. Not a pill was wasted. Nothing but death itself could stop the soldiers from taking the medicine. I asked one of their signal officers what type of codes were used in transmitting their operational messages. Typically he was evasive, but later, over a bowl of sake, he laughingly confided to me that the most secret messages were sent without dilution in the Japanese language. No foreigner, he said, could understand it.
The Japanese did change that later on, but giving up a secret like that, it must have been a pretty big bowl of sake. And and MacArthur was pretty adept about getting a very important secret like that out.
So then reports that Arthur submitted to Washington from Japan went beyond battle tactics and strategy. He was aware that Japanese victory over Russia did not mean Russia's elimination from the Far East. This vast, complex area, restless under the boot of European domination, might well be the arena of future world struggle. As a result, he was ordered to extend his comprehensive evaluations to the colonial lands of the Orient, Southeast Asia, and India. His itinerary would take him from Yokohama to Calcutta by the way of Hong Kong, Singapore, Rangoon. From Calcutta, he would investigate the northwest frontier at Peshawar and Quetta, thence to Bombay, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Madras, Colombo. He was then to return north through Java, Siam, Indochina, to Shanghai. Several months were to be devoted to China. I was accompanying him as an aide de camp. We were 9 months in travel, traversing countless miles of land, so rich in color, so fabled in legend, so vital to history that the experience was without doubt the most important factor of preparation in my entire life. We discussed defense plans behind closed doors and inspected military fortifications in critical areas on the spot.
Okay, so notice the discretion. They didn't discuss everything in public. They just looked at things in public. Behind closed doors, they discussed it. And you see, he's moved now from being an engineer to being a military intel officer or attaché to military. That's because he was traveling with his father, which was kind of a perk that most enlistees wouldn't get in their first 4 6 years service.
So they had dinner with the actual king of Siam. That was based on the guy was based in the movie The King and I.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's quite an affair. Does he mention that in particular, what the king might have said to him, or
Uh,
advice they might have given him?
yeah, at a dinner given by the king, wowzers. Shula Longkorn of Siam, a progressive monarch devoted to raising the standard of living of his people, the lights suddenly went out and there was much confusion. I had noticed a fuse box near where I was seated and promptly replaced the burned out fuse. The king, his father King Mongkut, the subject of Margaret Landon's book Anna and the King of Siam, had 92 wives and 77 children, and was so delighted he proposed to decorate me there and then. Happily, I had the common sense to decline. The true historic significance in the sense of destiny that these lands of the western Pacific Indian Ocean now assume became part of me. They were to color and influence all the days of my life. Here lived almost half the population of the world, with probably more than half of the raw products to sustain future generations. Here was Western civilization's last earth frontier. It was crystal clear to me that the future, and indeed the very existence of America, were irrevocably intertwined with Asia and its islands outposts. It was to be 16 years before I returned to the Far East, but always was its mystic hold upon me.
He's quite an elegant writer, as you can see, and for a military man. And well, the King of Siam, he's legendary for his hospitality and his erudition, and is willing to learn the best things, technological things of the West. And the Thai people are very friendly, and have always been allies of the United States. Um, so after his his 9-month tour of the Orient with his father as attaché. What does he go on to do?
He returns to Washington, D.C.
He probably has to write lots of reports.
Yeah, then he becomes the aide-de-camp to President Roosevelt.
Oh,
That's
really?
Theodore Roosevelt.
Okay, and what year did this take place?
The fall of 1906.
Okay, so Theodore Roosevelt, for those who don't know, was a Republican, and while he was Secretary of War, he resigned his position when the Spanish-American War broke out. He went to Texas, raised a volunteer regiment, and fought in Cuba, and quite victorious, even though a lot of his men died of dysentery, and that won him such fame in American eyes that he was elected president. Never again did the Department of War or the Department of Defense allow people to raise voluntary regiments because the deep state was already in formation and they didn't want anyone getting to the presidency that they couldn't control. And Roosevelt was a real make America great president. We already covered this in a previous show that the phrase make America great was actually coined by Theodore Roosevelt, one of his speechwriters. So Trump didn't invent that. Trump just added the word again, but a different caliber man.
So then he has another talk by Theodore Roosevelt on Asia. I greatly admired Theodore Roosevelt. His prophetic vision of Asia politics marked him as a statesman of brilliant imagination. Assuming the office of president, he found a government subordinate in the councils of the world, and now 5 years later, had firmly established it in the first rank. The U.S. was admired and respected, its favor sought after, its citizenship esteemed in the remotest corners of the globe. To an unprecedented degree, regardless of party, he had the support of the public. His vigor, courage, and abounding vitality, his lack of presidential pomposity, his familiarity with all manners of men, even his loudness of action and utterance, stimulated all to raise themselves above the ordinary level of their ability and their desires. He was greatly interested in my views on the Far East, and talked with me long and often. I once asked him to what single factor did he attribute his extraordinary popularity with the masses. He replied, "To put into words what is in their hearts and minds, but not their mouths. You must listen to the grass grow." When I became angered at an utterly unfounded criticism of him dreamed up in the editorial room of a local paper, he said, "I like to have them talk well of me, but I'd rather have them talk badly than not talk at all."
Okay, so Roosevelt was one of the last great American presidents. He was not an ideologue, and though he was not a Catholic and um, didn't really avoid the U.S. getting co-opted into the Pilgrim Society's plan for converting America from isolationist, they wouldn't have been able to do it if he was reelected. And a lot when he ran for he ran. I think he held office once or twice, and then he ran a third time after being defeated once. All the Masonic forces came out to keep him from being reelected. The agenda on the table for World War One and the which was engineered by the Pilgrim Society wouldn't have been able to achieve with Roosevelt. Roosevelt was just too independent, too commonsensical, too honest, and not at all tolerant of nefarious conspiracies. So he served under a great president. And so I assume he's still in the military. He spends his whole life in the military, AJ?
Yeah. So he finally graduates engineering school after a long delay.
In what year?
1908. So,
Okay, so
yeah. So after graduating from engineer school, I served for a short time on river and harbor duties in Wisconsin. In 1908, was ordered to Fort Leavenworth for duty with the 3rd Battalion of Engineers. As a junior company commander, I was assigned to Company K, which was the lowest rated of the 21 companies at the post. But I soon recognized that the inherent potentials in its personnel provided I could keep them sober enough while on duty. I had watched my father and First Sergeant Ripley too long not to have learned this trick. By praising them when they were good and shaming them when they were bad, by raising their pride and developing their sense of self-respect. I soon began to convince them they were the best of the lot. I hiked them 25 miles a day, made them break all speed records in pontoon bridge building, taught them to be demolition experts, lauded their natural ability to shoot and ride, and when the general inspection came, they were the champions. I could not have been happier if they had made me a general. They did make me an adjutant of the battalion, and I became the lecturer in the general service schools and in the cavalry school in Fort Riley. On February 27, 1911, I was promoted to a grade of captain. My years of service at Fort Leavenworth were filled with various details that tended to complete my military education as a combat engineer officer. Not the least of these was a tour of duty at my request in the Panama Canal Zone to study the vast engineering project being brought to completion under Colonel George Goethals. I studied the principles of mass sanitation from Colonel William C. Gorgas and learned much of the complexities of large-scale supply from an Point Old West Point friend of the class of 1900, Robert E. Wood, who later, as the head of Sears, Roebuck and Company, so revolutionized the system of retail sales.
Okay, so he knew a lot of famous people. He was important. He made really good decisions about postings when he had the freedom to do that. For those that don't know, Leavenworth is in the northeast corner of Kansas. It's a has a military university today, and I can just imagine what his battalion thought when he said, "We're going to march 25 miles today," and he did them every day. Um, you know, you would be hard find any military on the earth today could march 25 miles a day and not drop dead after a week. So he must have also seen that they were fed well and slept well, and at least had some comfortable shoes, But if you demand much and you are a good leader, you can make excellent men. And that's why we don't have that anymore, because the leaders we have in the modern times and even modern militaries are like half baked. Oh, we don't want to offend anyone. You used to have to march in your full kit, and now they have them go out in jogging shorts. It's ridiculous. No, I don't know what happened if the United States would be invaded, but we wouldn't do too well. So that brings us up to what year, AJ, now?
September
Outbreak of this.
5th, 1912.
Okay, so on the eve of the opening of the First World War, a war that will eventually involve our U.S. armed forces we entered lately, there was a lot of intelligence being gathered during that war by the United States, because it's going to be the first modern war, and it will shock military experts around the world who hadn't yet understood how war would change with mass industrial production of armaments, especially artillery and artillery shells, machine guns,
So
and bullets.
on September 5th, 1912, his father's old regiment, the 24th Wisconsin, was to hold its 50th and last reunion. My father had been ill and had sorrowfully sent his regrets at being unable to attend. The day proved to be the hottest of the season. The governor and senators had promised attendance, but the heat caused them to cancel the engagement. In this emergency, they begged their old commander to attend. In spite of my mother's earnest remonstrance, he went. There were but 90 of them left, as they sat around the table in Grand Army Hall, retelling the old war stories, singing in the old war songs. Then the toastmaster called on my father. Still straight and commanding, he recalled the old days. They were again changing front at Murfreesboro, crossing Peachtree Creek at Atlanta, closing the gap at Franklin. Your indomitable regiment, he continued, and then he faltered. His face grew ashen white. He then was down for good. Dr. William J. Cronin, the regimental surgeon, rushed once more to his side. Comrades, the general is dying, he said simply. In the middle of the room, the Reverend Paul B. Jenkins began to repeat the Lord's Prayer. Then those 90-year-old men who had followed him up Missionary Ridge into the blazing fire of a dozen battlefields knelt by the side of their old commander and joined in. When the prayer ended, he was dead. The adjutant, Captain Edwin Parsons, took from the wall of the battle-torn flag that he had so gallantly carried and wrapped it around the general. Captain Parsons stood in silence for a moment, gazing at his dead commander, then fell forward over the body and within 2 weeks passed on. My whole world changed that night. Never have I been able to heal the wound in my heart.
And I would say it's quite significant that the commander who didn't die in all the battles died in the presence of his men on that hot summer day while giving a talk reminiscing of their victories. What, you know, this is not to praise merely natural things, but he did die with the Our Father being said. He wasn't Catholic himself, but he had the consolation to die in the presence of his men, and they had that consolation to be there for his death. This is probably a good point. We pause, AJ, for our next show. It's going to be about MacArthur's life during this First World War, which is going to be of great interest. We've already covered a fair amount of material today. What do we have to look forward?
So, before the war is declared, right when the war is declared, MacArthur is first fighting down in Mexico. Then he returns to Washington, getting prepared for the coming fight in Europe. And then war is declared. And so we'll see how all that happens.
Okay, so he's down fighting in Mexico. He wouldn't have been fighting in the company of Patton, would he?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's going to be very interesting. And you know, you don't find any other Catholic channels or any YouTube channels talking about American history generals like this so much. It's something we should all know, though it's not particularly a Catholic topic. But you know, if you're an American citizen, you should know your own history and the great generals. And I highly recommend these programs for homeschoolers so that your children grow up admiring men who had good natural virtue. And you don't always have to read the biographies of saints. You can also read the biographies of men who had good natural virtue and were famous in history, especially of your own country, because it's very good formation, and it gives your children a fallback. If they should ever waver in the faith, they still have the example of good, honest men on the natural level to admire. Thank you, AJ, for having me on this program.
You're welcome. This is Zona Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.